Hey everybody, today is Monday, May 26th, 2025. Coming up on the show today, from the Apple TV Plus original series, The Studio, editor Eric Kissack.
I mean, it was a really fun exercise even before I started because I sort of sat down and got to think to myself, what is it that an editor does? I would be marking up the script and I would be like, is this word necessary? Is this joke necessary? It's a good joke, but is it a great joke, you know? And it was a strange, terrifying thing to go up to Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg at the end of each take and be like, I don't know about this joke. It's not that funny. I have to say that I've not talked to Seth and Evan about how much they're giving away about what they did on this show. So this whole interview could get me fired.
Yes, all that and more on this edition of The Rough Cut. Okay, who's up for a few laughs? You are? Well, that's good. Me too. And we're going to have some today. Or at the very least, we're going to talk about a show that offers up more than just a few laughs. Especially if you love this thing they call show business. Joining us on The Rough Cut today is editor Eric Kissack. Eric is the editor behind the Apple TV Plus show The Studio. As the name implies, it's about a studio. The newly minted head of that studio is Matt Remick, played by Seth Rogen. In fact, the show is the creation of Seth Rogen and his longtime partner in crime, Evan Goldberg. Cinephile Matt Remick takes over Continental with the intention of making serious prestige films. But can he do that while resisting CEO Griffin Mills' wishes that he bring the studio untold box office gold, overseeing the production of a movie about the Kool-Aid Man? I mean, how can that go wrong? Of course, Matt wants to have the best of both worlds, and watching him try to do that is where a lot of the comedy comes from. You will probably notice that we talk a lot in this interview about the way the show is shot, and that is because the show is predominantly presented as a oneer. Of course, there are scene changes in each episode breaking the continuity of those oneers, except for the second episode, which is called The Oneer. How would this unique shooting style affect Eric's duties and workload on the show? That is a good question, if I do say so myself. So we should get to asking it. And by we, I mean me. And we will, in just a moment or two. First, a quick shout out to the fine folks who helped sponsor this talk with Eric, those benevolent audio gods at Extreme Music. Now, you know how it goes with production audio. Sometimes you know exactly what kind of music you want. Other times, not so much. Either way, Extreme Music has your back. Their production audio platform is built to meet you right where you are, whether that's a super specific musical style or just a vibe you're trying to capture. You can search their massive catalog the traditional way, using rich metadata terms like mood, tempo, genre, lyrics, even by specific composers like my Bavarian hero Hans Zimmer. You can also describe your scene in plain English, or probably a few other languages, and let their artful intelligence suggest tracks to you that fit the tone and tempo. And if you've already got a temp track in mind, well, just upload it, and they'll find you tracks that match. Extreme Music also offers customizable stems, alternate links, and, this is key, a frictionless licensing process. You don't even have to leave the site. You find the track, you license it, you're good to go. So whether you know what you need or just know how it should feel, Extreme Music will take your story right where it needs to be. Okay, our tour guide for the day? From the Apple TV Plus original series, The Studio, editor Eric Kissack.
You're probably more familiar with them than I am.
Well, we're going to find out. I don't know. I know there's definitely some crossover in the work you've done in the past with projects Seth Rogen has been tied to, but no real direct connection that I could find. Not that I'm the greatest IMDb detective. So let's start with how you came to be attached to the studio and what role Seth may or may not have had to do with it.
Yeah, so Seth and I kind of first crossed paths on Bruno. Funny enough, the Sasha Baron Cohen film was one of my early editing credits, and Seth was a writer on the movie. He was already sort of like making a name for himself, and so he wasn't one of the main writers, but he would come in and do punch-ups and that kind of thing. But we didn't really get to know one another until he brought me in to do a comedy pass on Sausage Party. It's an animated film. It was in really good shape, but he just wanted to sort of like tighten up a few things. And I wound up kind of moving a few scenes around, which was sort of surprising and very delightful for him. And it was a great working experience. And after that, he sort of called me over and over again for various things. I edited the Black Monday pilot, which he directed. I edited on Pam and Tommy, which he produced. And then I did another comedy pass on the Ninja Turtles movie that came out last year, I believe. And so, yeah, we worked together off and on for a while. And when this project came around, he, reached out and we had an early Zoom conversation. He told me how he wanted to make it, with these sort of long takes and some one-ers and that kind of thing. He basically said, I kind of think the only way this makes sense is for you to be on set the whole time. And I was like, yeah, I was kind of thinking the same thing. So it was sort of like we had this like collaboration over the years that became like a very tight relationship by spending 60 days on set together, sitting side by side. So yeah, that's kind of the Seth and Eric story.
That's a good story. And it's a story that leads us to the studio. And Hollywood can be an easy and certainly fun target when it comes to doing a send-up of the eccentric people and, let's say, ridiculous circumstances behind it all. Knowing that, how did Seth and Evan describe and pitch it to you? And more importantly, were they injecting, as far as you know, any real-life people or experiences into the material?
They didn't really pitch the show to me that much. They sent me the scripts and I read them and I got it pretty quickly. They wanted it to be pushed, but also not that wildly divergent from the reality. The kernel of every episode is something that has either happened to them or someone close to them. And so, it's always a little bit exaggerated, but it's not that far off from what I can understand. And yeah, most of the characters are based on people they know and people they love, like good friends of theirs. And this is clearly a show that's made by people that love this business, even though sometimes it can be infuriating and crazy. And so I think that was sort of what we were hoping would come through the whole time is that, yeah, this movie business is silly and stupid, but it's also wonderful. People get to make incredible, lasting contributions to human endeavor.
I always ask about references, well, almost always. And the studio doesn't even try to hide one very obvious one. I mean, Robert Altman's The Player. Mm-hmm. That film not only famously begins with an elaborate oneer, but the main character is named Griffin Mill. Mm-hmm. Here's the studio, which is primarily made up of oneers. Even episode 2 is called The Oneer. And there is a character, the CEO, played by Bryan Cranston, named Griffin Mill. So out of the gate, there's a tie-in to The Player.
Yes.
Other than that, did Seth and Evan give you any reference points, either for the series as a whole or for specific episodes to draw from?
We talked a lot about Succession.
Really?
Yeah. I think mostly because, Succession takes place in the world of high finance and I guess like media mogul companies. And, the idea was that it was sort of in this very specific world with a lot of specific references, and yet you could still enjoy it and enjoy the characters and enjoy living in the world without maybe you didn't understand every word they were saying. And so that was sort of like a reference for us because, we wanted to be constantly throwing out lingo and having things that would actually happen in the business. And we didn't maybe want to explain that much, but at the same time, having everything clear and relatable. So that was one thing we talked about quite a bit. There's obviously like a bunch of Chinatown references in our noir episode, a lot of just noir references in general. But it wasn't like every episode was like based on a different movie or that kind of thing. That said, the whole show is referential in a way that is sort of like baked into the DNA of it. Like music was a big part of it. Every time there would be a scene, okay, they're arriving in Vegas. What's the song that they used in Swingers when they're arriving in Vegas? And we're like, oh, great, let's use that song. Like these little kind of referential moments. We literally used the score for Chinatown at the end of our noir episode. We have this episode, The Pediatric Oncologist, that sort of felt like our most Woody Allen-ish episode, where he goes to this doctor's gala. Matt goes to this doctor's gala, and we were like, let's use all music that Woody Allen used in his movies. It's all the songs in there from Woody Allen movies. The pilot has a lot to do with Martin Scorsese, and we used 3 songs from famous Martin Scorsese movies. So that was sort of this like thing that we sort of baked in to the whole series.
For fans of the series, of which I'm sure there are many, I encourage them to follow you on Instagram because you've shared a lot of great behind-the-scenes pictures and anecdotes, one of which speaks directly to how the show is shot, and it's a post about Mark, the camera operator. Yes. And you say, because of the way we shoot the show, not only does Mark have to memorize all of his moves at all the right moments, which basically means memorizing the script, but he has to do it consistently every single time and deal with my annoying request to add a pan here or hold a beat there to give me a bit more flexibility in the edit. He's a kind, hunky genius. Oh, there's 2 of us. So this reminds me of a question I asked someone who worked on Adolescence, the Netflix show that's all oneers. And that is, what does an editor do when there's nothing to edit? In their case, it was a lot of QC work and identifying things that needed to be removed from shots. Sounds like it was a little different for you. Tell me all about what you had to do as an editor for the studio.
I mean, it was a really fun exercise even before I started because I sort of sat down and got to think to myself, what is it that an editor does? Because, I'd realized for decades I've been kind of doing it instinctually and not really thinking too much about what it is I was really doing, especially in the context of not being able to do much of it once I got to the editing room. So I sort of honed in on three main areas. There's the pacing, especially in comedy. Comedy is all about pacing and rhythm. And so I knew that I need to be able to create that pacing and rhythm on set. Bucket two would be improv. A lot of what comedy editors do is combining their favorite improvs or even just favorite performances. Let's say like Catherine Hahn does something really amazing and wonderful in take 15, and then Ike Barinholtz does something really amazing and wonderful in take 16. You don't want to have to choose between those two things. You like to be able to figure out a way to combine them. And then bucket three would just be like transitions, basically making sure that if a shot, we could be shot the whole thing out of order. And so, I would have to keep track, like, oh, okay, the next scene, which we already shot, starts on a close-up. So we probably want to end the scene in a wide shot, that kind of thing. So let me dig in a little bit more. So bucket one is timing, pacing. So a lot of what I was doing is just like hammering the script. We would do the scene 3 or 4 times and I would be marking up the script and I would be like, is this word necessary? Is this joke necessary? It's a good joke, but is it a great joke? And it was a strange, terrifying thing to go up to Seth Rogen and Evan Goldberg at the end of each take and be like, I don't know about this joke. It's not that funny. And then like 90% of the time they would agree with me, which was a huge relief. And so, it was like literally like, I put myself in the brain space of being in the edit and being like, the scene is like fun, but like if we remove this one beat or if we sped up this moment or if we got Ike to say his line as he's going to the door so that we don't have as much shoe leather. Normally I would cut to a reaction shot to like speed up that walk, but I can't do that. So it was all these kind of things of like crunching the pace and the timing as they were shooting it so that by the time we got to like take 15, 16, 17, the whole thing was just singing. It was just like this alive, exciting scene. And a lot of that had to do with the actors just sort of like learning the scene and getting more familiar with it. But a lot of what I was doing is sort of making sure that the structure of what they were doing was as tight as possible. So that was bucket one. And then bucket two, improv, that was probably the trickiest thing. And that was where I was driving Mark crazy, but I think he appreciated it in the end. I would identify these moments in the scene where I was like, okay, Catherine Hahn's saying something different every time here. Catherine O'Hara's doing something crazy every time here. I'm going to want to switch takes at this point and at this point and at this point in the scene. So I get together with Mark and I'm like, okay, Mark, after Catherine says this line, I need you to pan over to Seth for a second so that if I need to, in that pan, I can switch takes. Pans were sort of like the easiest way for us to switch takes. So unlike Adolescence, we essentially did shoot oneers. We shot, the scenes completely from beginning to end and, without a lot of screw ups. The actors were incredible. But we always knew that we'd be wanting to combine takes for the reason of getting the best comic performances and the best versions of the improv. So usually every scene had 2 or 3 moments where I knew I could switch takes when I needed to. And that was basically how we made sure that we had the funniest stuff in every scene.
Hearing your description, I don't want to step on any toes here, but it sounds like you're directing to a certain degree. And I just can't help but say that.
I mean, it's so nice of you to say that. And a couple of people have said that to me before. I mean, there is a giant part of what I wasn't doing, like I wasn't working with the actors directly. There's a lot of, I've directed before and I love directing. And I can tell you that what I was doing was collaborating with the directors, but maybe this is false modesty, but I don't really think I was directing.
Fair enough. I do want to go back to the number of takes. In most episodes, the show is at least broken down into scenes. Episode 2, the oneer, the whole show is a oneer. How many takes of that episode did you end up doing?
So that episode was actually shot in 5 pieces and stitched together by our amazing VFX supervisor, Sandro Blattner. So we shot 5 days, 5 pieces, and each piece probably shot around 19 or 20 times. I think the most we ever shot any scene was like 25 times, and our sweet spot was always usually in between like 15 and 20.
Well, I know some editors, when they're going through dailies, they'll focus on the last, especially if they're pressed for time, the last take that was shot, assuming that's probably the best one if that's where they stopped. The way that you did this show, is that kind of a given that the last take would be the one that you used because you kept iterating until you got it the way you needed it?
No, in fact, we sort of had this joke on set that we always had to peak and then come down. And so as soon as we had one take that was like worse than the previous one, we would move on because we just knew that like we weren't going to get any better. It was never going to like go down and then go back up again, you know? So yeah, usually like the take before the last one or even the one before that or the one before that was the best. But, you know, a lot of what I was doing was, I mean, I would sit there with my iPad and I would take a lot of notes. And sometimes I would just say like, you know, okay, this line, which is like my favorite line in the scene, say, you know, I'd be like, oh, there's a great version in take 12, a great version in take 14, a great version in take 17. So I was taking a lot of notes. And so a lot of what I was doing in the edit was just sort of referencing my notes and kind of like clicking the pieces together like little Lego sets.
Just so I can provide context for people that are starting to wonder, like, what are these guys actually talking about? In this episode, The Oner, Sarah Polley plays herself directing a film. And she's trying to shoot this glorious golden hour before the sun expires Oner. And Seth Rogen's character, studio boss Matt Remick, he's unintentionally sabotaging this shoot. And they're talking about doing the Oner, and she says in a very meta way, she won't be using any tricks like whip pans to hide stitches between shots. It will be a true Oner. So you were kind enough to say, yeah, of course I use things like whip pans to do stitches. What other techniques do you have that enable you to do these little hidden edits?
The two main ones were whip pans and then crosses. So anytime we go behind someone's back or anytime like, an extra crosses frame, we could use that as a wipe and kind of, digitally stitch together the two pieces. Some of those behind the back ones are like bonkers. Like, I got to the point where I would just be throwing different wipes at Sandro, our VFX supervisor, just because I wanted to see if he could do it, and he would look at it and he'd be like, there's no way, there's no, there's like, we're seeing like 60% of the frame, it's uncovered by this person's back. And I'm like, okay. And then he would come back an hour later and he'd be like, I did it. There's a couple in there also that are just straight up crazy stitches without any whips or wipes. There's an episode 5, The War, that starts with one of my favorite shots. Matt and Sal, his sort of number 2, played by Ike Barinholtz, arrive at the studio one morning and they both come in their cars and the camera's on this techno crane and it's like following them both in as they park, and it follows Ike as he walks to the studio and then it raises up and pulls up into a drone shot that then flies over the studio, lands on the other side of the studio into another techno crane that then lands with Chase, the character Quinn, as she pulls into her parking lot. And all of that is just like digital stitching that I couldn't even begin to explain to you. It's very impressive. But it also had, like, what I love about that shot is it wasn't just us showing off. The purpose of the shot was to show that Ike has this amazing parking spot that's right next to the studio, and Chase is like way off on the other side of the studio with this bad parking lot that she hates. And it sets up the dynamic of the entire episode.
I'm so glad you brought up that episode, and I'm so glad that you're being open about, there's all kinds of tricks to try and make this work, because that one shot at the beginning, as I watched that, I was like, okay, there's just no way. I mean, even with drones or whatever, I mean, Sal had to go park so far away, the weather changed during the shot. So I'm glad we've established a baseline of honesty in our relationship so early in the podcast.
I have to say that I've not talked to Seth and Evan about how much they're giving away about what they did on the show. So this whole interview could get me fired.
That's what I'm here for.
I hope not. I mean, those tricks that we did, I think, are just incredibly impressive and part of the filmmaking vocabulary that they used and mastered. So I think it's to their credit that these things happened.
By the time you get back to the editing room to finish, what kind of stuff is left for you to do? It seems like that phase of post is going to get really truncated because you put in a lot of effort and hard work up front.
Probably the thing that took us the longest time in the edit was finding the music. We kind of tried a lot of different temp scores, tried no music, tried a lot of music, tried a little bit of music. Early on, Birdman, for obvious reasons, was a reference for the show. And at some point, we said, what is the Birdman score? And grabbed the Birdman score and realized it was all mostly this kind of like percussive jazz drumming that was fun and it kind of like helped with the tension and it didn't get in the way of the dialogue and it kind of like just kept the rhythms of the show moving. And so we were like, let's try that. And so we started putting in the Birdman score and it started working so well that we ended up calling Antonio Sanchez, who wrote the music for Birdman. And we were like, hey, would you want to work on the show? And he jumped at the chance. So he started delivering score probably like halfway through the shoot, actually, just a few like kind of things that he was working on, like drum sketches. And it was just so exciting every time one of them came in. You know, it just made the scene twice as exciting and fun and funny. And then as we went on, as we sort of were like locking the cuts, he would start like really dialing it in and getting this percussive elements to really start dancing around the dialogue. So that was sort of like the most time intensive part of the whole process. And then obviously visual effects took a while. There was probably like 2 or 3 scenes that we lifted, and they weren't like obvious lifts. Like it was like scenes that we lived with for like a pretty long time. And then we were kind of like, you know, this episode's feeling a little slow. Oh my God, what do we do? You know, we're locked in. And then we're like, wait a second, we could probably lose the scene. So that took a little bit of time. But yeah, you're right. I mean, my general rhythm was that we would show up on set in the morning, we would do a run through with the actors, and then the camera crew would usually take about 2 hours to light and sort of rehearse their camera moves. And during that time, I would just go to my office and I would click in the pieces from the previous day and essentially have almost everything that we had shot the previous day edited in those 2 hours. And then I would like throw it on my iPad and like walk over to set and show it to Seth and Evan, and everyone would be like, hey, this is working. It was a very unusual process in that sense, in that we really like got a real sense of how things were going. Feedback was just very, very quick.
So again, in your amazing Instagram page, I'll call it, you say it was one of the hardest jobs I've ever had. What made it the hardest job, or one of the hardest jobs you've ever had?
I think a big part of it was defining my role, which is not something I'm used to doing. I think I mentioned maybe in that post, and when I showed up on set the first day, I didn't have anywhere to sit. No one had really been like told, hey, there's an editor on set and he needs to have a spot near the monitor, you know? So I didn't even know that the seats that people sit in on set, that's the responsibility of the prop department. I had no idea. Prop department, they're the ones responsible. And so like a week or 2 into the shoot, I like met one of the prop people and she was lovely and we chatted, and our kids are like the same age. And the next day there was a chair with my name on it sitting on set. So it was like these little things that you learn. And so, yeah, I mean, it was just like, it just felt, at least for the first few weeks, it felt like a total fish out of water experience. I didn't know the rhythms. I didn't know like what time lunch happens. I didn't know just all the things that people who spend their lives on set know. So that was a big part of it. I kind of felt like, you know, this is me putting a lot of pressure on myself, but I sort of felt like if we're not getting what we need, if these pieces aren't working, I screwed up, you know, like I was putting it on myself, because it was like at the end of shooting the scene, everyone would sort of look to me and they'd be like, do we have it? And I'd be like, yeah. And like, it just felt like an insane amount of pressure. But once I sort of started realizing, A, how good everyone in the cast and the crew was, and B, that like we did have some flexibility when we got back to the office in terms of doing a little bit of manipulation here and there, combining takes and that kind of thing, I kind of chilled out. But, you know, I mean, the last 2 episodes of the show take place in Vegas. We like lived in a casino in Vegas for 2 weeks. We were like shooting on the casino floor at 2 a.m. It was insane. Like, I don't know how people do it. Like, it's a crazy job to, and there's a reason why. I mean, I don't want to generalize about all editors, but like a lot of editors appreciate the calm, you know, holy space of the edit room where you can think and wrap your head around problems, and you can take a walk and have coffee. And like set is just a very, very, very different vibe.
What was the schedule behind shooting and cutting it? I know you were on set for 60 days. Is that cumulative, sequential? I mean, do you go do all production and then just go back and then you do all editing? Or is there some sort of episodic feel to the work that you're doing along the way?
It was pretty non-episodic. Some of the episodes we shot as one, and then when we were done, they were clicked together and edited together pretty quickly. But then there were pieces, we had this joke about the pilot, like how every time we thought we were done at shooting the pilot, we weren't done shooting the pilot. We kept forgetting. Like one of us would walk on set and be like, here it is, the last day of the pilot shoot. And someone else would be like, oh no, we have this piece to pick up at Matt's house. Damn! The pilot was the one that just kept going. We just kept shooting more and more and more. But yeah, I mean, 60 days, it was 60 days. I think we had a 1 week off in the middle of it. It was pretty much 60 days of shooting, me clicking pieces together and doing some massaging when I could. And then afterwards, all the episodes were like basically watchable within a couple days of shooting. It was sort of a little bit of a free-for-all. We would sort of like jump from episode to episode, whatever we felt like. in the moment. It was a little chaotic, but it was fun. And, eventually Apple was sort of like, hey, you guys have to finish this. And we're like, right. We started locking and delivering the episodes. But yeah, it was not like, I've done network comedies where it's like very rigorous and we have to deliver this episode every week. And it wasn't quite like that.
Did it matter which order you released them? Because other than the first and last 2 episodes, there isn't much continuity. I mean, you start off with getting to know Matt Remick and Continental Studios and the Kool-Aid movie, which we don't even really revisit again until the last 2 in Vegas. So you have all these truly episodic episodes, I guess that's why they call them episodes, along the way, which you could have pretty much put them in any order. I don't know if there's anything I would have missed that dictated one should go before the other, but did you have some sort of freedom to go, you know what, we're going to do this one before that one and nobody's going to mind?
Yes, we definitely moved the episodes around quite a bit. The only ones that was sort of not locked into place, but sort of like had to be rough. There's another episode called Casting, which is all about casting the Kool-Aid movie. And we knew that one had to be sort of towards the end. So that one ended up being 7th. Originally, the noir episode was 8, and we moved it up to 4. There was like a bit of a shuffle, kind of just based on people's feelings about the way the episodes grew and shrank and that kind of thing. I think they wanted the last few to sort of feel like this build of like insanity. I really give Seth and Evan a lot of credit. It sort of feels like all comedy has become serialized, all comedy has become drama, or at least like the prestige comedies. And they really wanted this to feel like a little bit like a series of mini movies, that you could sort of watch in kind of any order you wanted to, with a couple of exceptions. And I think that's part of what makes it feel a little fresh and exciting.
One more thing on the oneers. I think this is the most I've ever said oneers in one day. Audio. How did that affect the need for ADR?
Yeah.
You would think that would be a bit more of a challenge, doing everything in a sort of a oneer style and dealing with all those mics. And I don't think you're going to be able to do booms in the same way you would.
Right.
So tell me about the ADR aspect.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the quality, it was fantastic. Our on-set sound mixers were really great. It was mostly lavs, but they were good lavs. they were well placed. So we didn't end up having to do a lot of fixing things for clarity or noise or anything like that. We did end up doing a lot of ADR, and it was mostly just to like add energy, like the whole thing. We wanted to feel like this steamroller of a show where it just keeps going and never stops. And so sometimes like there were moments where there'd be like a gap or a pause, and we were like, well, let's just fill that gap or pause with, we're on Ike's back for a second, let's throw in a word here, we pan away from Catherine here, let's say something, so we were adding just like a lot of filler stuff, and because they're so funny, like the filler stuff ended up being really funny. So a lot of the kind of little like throwaways, asides that you hear were things that we added. And then, this is sort of a funny aside as well, but because we were all lavs, Seth early on was like, whenever we do ADR with lavs, it always sounds wrong because on set, the lavs are underneath people's clothing. And when we get into the booth, they always put the lavs on top of people's clothing. So our sound guy was like, I can solve that. And so he had this shirt that he just draped over the chair of the ADR. And then whenever the person would sit in the ADR, he would have them wear the shirt, and the lav was taped to the inside of the shirt so that it would match the sound perfectly. And honestly, it was like the best sounding ADR I'd ever heard. The only problem was we realized we had to clean the shirt more frequently than we thought we would. So we ended up having to launder it. But yeah, it was a really funny little innovation that I hope people do more now.
Well, props helped you out with the chair. Wardrobe helps you out with the shirt.
Yep.
When you were on set, did you ever pull a Matt Remick and go to wardrobe and change out your clothes?
I did ask them for a coat one night. It gets chilly at night in LA. I can't even remember what episode it was, but I remember like just asking wardrobe for a coat, and they gave one to me, just like Matt Remick does.
The title card of the show features the words "filmed on location in Los Angeles," and you get to edit on set. Where was home base when you weren't on set, and how did that editing setup compare to the one you had to travel with? Was there much difference in terms of what you would have sort of back in the classic cutting room compared to having to be a little nimble on set?
So our home base was Warner Brothers. We had an office at Warner Brothers for posts for the whole time. Originally, the plan was not to have me edit on location, but I realized that would probably be a good idea about halfway through the shoot, and asked Mike Manning, our post producer, if that was possible, and just kind of figured that they would like throw a laptop at me or something. But, I just would arrive at set and there'd just be like a room somewhere with my entire Avid set up with like a standing desk, and like it was all very exciting. The Wonder episode was shot in this beautiful house in Silver Lake, and they set up my Avid in the basement of the house. The basement being this like glorious wood paneled beautiful room with this giant window that looks out over the Silver Lake Reservoir. It was like the nicest editing room I've ever had. When we were editing the Golden Globes episode, I was backstage in the dressing room with my Avid. It was pretty exciting and fun. When we were in Vegas, I had like a suite at the Venetian with my edit room. So yeah, we traveled with the whole thing, which was wonderful.
Do you have a favorite from all those amazing locations to be cutting?
I mean, the Silver Lake house. It's called the Silver Top House, and it's in Silver Lake, and it's one of the most glorious houses I've ever been in. We were all deeply sad to leave that house. If you ever get a chance to tour it, I highly recommend it.
I'll put it on the list. Let's talk a little bit about Seth and Evan as co-directors. What is their style as co-directors, and does it change any with Seth actually directing himself? When he's being featured in a scene, does he sort of lay back and Evan drives the bus? How does that work?
I mean, Seth is featured in almost every scene.
He is. That's what made me wonder.
I mean, they've been working together for so long. They just have this easy collaboration. Because we shoot them in these long takes, it's not like we're like running around like, okay, now we got to grab this insert shot. And now we got to, it was like we'd shoot a take. Seth would amble back over to the monitor. We'd watch the take. Performance-wise, he's really great at self-correcting and fixing any mistakes, but also just like tweaking lines to make them flow better and that kind of thing. So he was constantly doing that for himself. Evan was kind of like more looking out for the other actors and giving them notes and tips and coming up with jokes and that kind of thing for them. But yeah, they just sort of had this easy rapport, and it's really fun watching them work together. Again, because we were shooting these long takes, we actually had the time to kind of like watch and process and improve and iterate as we went along.
So do you mind if we go through some of the notes I made on the show that just these are sort of fan questions because I'm a fan. I want to ask them.
Of course.
Why not? I've got this microphone and everything. Episode 1, the promotion. Did Seth actually trip up the stairs when he talks about getting his justice and all the people who mocked him? He's running up the stairs in Continental and he trips.
Yep.
And it's like, well, that would be a good beat because of what he's talking about. And it's sort of, even though he's talking about getting one over on everybody that ever doubted him, there he is stumbling up the stairs. Yet at the same time, he did it so well. He just had to wonder, like, did he just actually just trip and they kept it?
He tripped and we kept it. Yeah, we had other takes that he did not trip, but we really liked that take. It was a great take and the trip just worked.
We've talked about Wonders so much, but that episode, The Wonder, is so crazy because Seth has to do some stunts, or maybe it's not Seth, but he falls down and then he's back up and he's bloody. Is there stitching there, or is it more of a Texas switch where the camera pans away and he sort of wipes some blood on his face? How'd you pull that off?
That was an elaborate digital stitch. That was Seth's stuntman who did that fall. It was one of our more challenging stitches. In fact, it was one that Sandro was pretty convinced wouldn't work. So we had an alt that was like a little bit less ambitious for an alt version of it, but luckily Sandro got the money version to work.
There are just so many great cameos. Episode 3, Ron Howard plays himself, of course, and he's working on a film for Matt called Alphabet City. There's the series that you have to edit, the studio, but then there's also content within this series. There's Ron's film.
Yeah.
And they're actually watching the film, and their enthusiasm sort of fades over time. They love it at first, and then it gets a little ponderous, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, we don't like this so much. Tell me about working on the content within the show, not just Alphabet City, but the other bits that you had to work on.
That was so much fun for me because, after a while, you sort of forget that, I would forget that I was actually an editor, and so then I would we'd shoot these scenes and I would show up the next morning and I'd remember oh my God, there's coverage and there's inserts and I would crack my knuckles and I'd be like, all right, here we go. And while shooting Alphabet City, we were all I'd watch this movie, Mackie and Franco together. It's, I don't know. It was really fun. And especially fun to, I shoot any kind of thriller reaction stuff is a lot of fun to cut in general. That was great. We ended up I ended up sort of killing myself to actually cut all that stuff to be ready for playback in the scenes where they're actually watching it. And I was so proud that I gotten it all together and it looked great. And then we get to set and we realized that there was no way to shoot the screen without seeing the shadow from the camera that was shooting the screen just because of the way the lights were placed and everything, so they were like, we'll just replace it, we'll just replace it in post. And I was like, but I worked so hard to get ready. Damn it. Yeah, that part was really fun. It was really, there's a trailer in episode 6 for Depocalypse.
Johnny Knoxville.
That was also super fun to cut. And then, actually cut trailers of all the movies that they did that were actually playing in the final episode in the presentation. And you see little snippets of them. Another one where I was like, I worked so hard to like cut these trailers, and then you see them for like a half second as the camera pans off, But they're all there. They all exist.
That episode, really, it's all about giving and getting notes, which is always a somewhat touchy subject.
Sure.
You've been working as an editor for a long time. Anything you've ever observed or saw in terms of somebody having to get or give a note that was just really funny or really awkward in the same way that it plays out in this episode? More little times than I can count. I can't think there's any like one amazing hilarious story. I will say that like I've worked with some really amazing comedic filmmakers like Sasha Baron Cohen and Ben Stiller and Seth and Evan. And the beautiful thing about working with those people, there's a lot of great things, but the most beautiful thing perhaps is the fact that studios, they mostly trust them. Like the kind of notes that you might get on another project, you don't really get on these, because they're not going to say like, hey, maybe there's a funnier way to do this thing. It's like, Seth probably knows the funniest way. Not that he's infallible, but the notes process was actually pretty smooth. I think all the studio executives were very self-conscious also about giving notes. How could you not be?
So yeah, I don't know. The whole process was very strange because we all were pretty convinced that we were making something good. I think the studio thought it was good. And I've been on things before where people are like, we're making something really good, and then it comes out and everyone hates it. So like I've long stopped predicting these things, but this one it was wonderful that people seem to like it as much as we did.
Before we move off of this one particular episode, I just have to say one of my favorite gags in the whole series is the quick one-liner about a film about an Australian chess team who cheats called Checkmate.
Yeah.
For some reason that caught me just right.
Yeah. That was a Alex Gregory special. Alex is a former writer for Veep and just like so great at just coming up with those like really subtle, funny things that just stick with you long after.
Please pass along my appreciation to Alex for that one.
I will.
Episode 4, The Missing Reel, another great one where a reel of film goes missing. And of course they shoot film because Matt Remick's a purist and he loves film.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a great open where he's in a projection booth.
Mm-hmm.
The projectionist is an older guy, and Matt is waxing on about how great film is. And basically the projectionist is like, are you kidding me? I hate film.
It's a pain in my ass.
Nobody can tell the difference between film and digital anyway. I don't think there would have been any way to shoot this particular series on film. Maybe I'm wrong, considering you did employ the stitching. But the question I want to ask is, did you ever work on any film projects? And do you have any sort of romantic notions about film? Or are you just like, no, digital, I don't ever want to look back?
I kind of got started like right when the transition away from film had kind of like really clicked in. So I don't really have a strong affiliation with film. I've at various times in my career, I've cut some commercials on the side, and I did once cut a campaign for Apple, and they shot on film. And when I got the dailies, I was like, okay, I kind of get it now because the colors look so rich and everything, looks so amazing. That said, I probably couldn't tell you the difference most of the time. That said, there was a brief discussion about shooting film on the studio, and I'm really glad they didn't because it would have been very crazy. But yeah, I think that was the goal at first, and then everyone sort of realized, we're taking enough big swings. Let's shoot it digital.
Yeah, I think that 60 days on set would have turned into 180, but
exactly.
Who knows? In this episode, you also do something I don't think I saw you do elsewhere in the series, and that was horizontal wipes or wipes of any kind. Tell me about that decision.
We were always sort of struggling with how to show time passing. A lot of the tricks that you usually do, like cut to a morning shot or cut to like sunrise or sunset or that kind of thing, we couldn't do. So it was just, it was for some reason in that episode, the passage of time was this thing that we were just struggling with. It wasn't anything obvious that we could sort of put our fingers on, but it just didn't feel right. And then, we sort of remembered that there is this noir tradition of dissolves and wipes and that kind of thing. And we just tried it and we liked it. We didn't talk too much about it. It was like, oh, that works. Let's do that.
Episode 6, Pediatric Oncologist, you said that's your favorite. You talked about it a little bit earlier about the Woody Allen vibes of it. Why is that one in particular your favorite?
I mean, honestly, mostly because I think Seth's performance is so good in that one. I mean, it's so much on his shoulders. For me, he perfectly rides this line of like being a jerk, but sympathetic, and you kind of are with him and then you're not with him and then you're with him. And I don't know. I just sort of marvel at his performance in that. And then, you know, to be honest, like I do think doctors are very important and, and that they should feel what they do is very essential. But I also think that what we do is important too. And so, you know, like I'm not going to get into an argument with a doctor about that. But, you know, I have been in situations like that. We all have, you know, everyone who works in the industry where someone is sort of like poo-pooing what we do as base or not as important as other things. And I'm sort of just like, I'm kind of with Matt. I'm like, why? Why was one thing have to be better than another?
I was with Matt the whole time.
Okay, good. I
Pompous doctors.
That was also a funny thing was that like literally like half the crew was like on Matt's side and half the crew wasn't. And so it was really fun getting into those arguments on set while Matt was having the arguments with the doctors.
Okay, so that's your favorite.
What was your favorite?
We'll get into it, but the Vegas stuff was just so crazy. I love that.
Great.
And also this next one, too, because I love Ike, and Sal Saperstein really gets to have his moment in episode 8, Golden Globes.
Yes, he does.
Not only does he get to have his moment, but the editor does, too, in a very small way, somewhat. I always ask editors, like, is there any way, shape, or form that you are in this series, maybe it's just a voice doing, you know, an announcement on the radio or actually in the background.
Right.
I'm not going to give away your story for you. So tell me about working on the Golden Globes episode and how it ended up that you were in this episode.
In a very, very small way. Yeah. We shot this pretty late in the series. This episode was a tour de force of production. We had 500 extras dressed beautifully. The room where they shoot the Golden Globes is where we shot this, the hotel, the Beverly Hilton. I think it looks better than the Golden Globes does. Like our production design team just did an incredible job making it look great. Everyone just brought it. And I kind of felt like I was just sort of sitting back and appreciating everyone else's work. I love this episode, but the rhythms on this episode are a little bit looser. So I wasn't like hammering every line, like, you know, making trims every second. In other words, I had less to do. And the second day, I think I started looking around and started realizing that I was dressed in a hoodie and felt a little schlubby. I was being surrounded by all these people that were dressed up. Weirdly, like half the extras were Russian, which is just a side note. Like everyone was speaking Russian. And I was like, what is happening here? Why is everyone Russian? They were very nice. So the third day, I decide I'm going to wear like my sport coat, you know, and like a nice pair of pants and nice shoes. And I look over and I realize that Pete Hayek, one of our other main writers, is also dressed up kind of nice. And I'm like, oh, he's got the same idea. We're both trying to look a little classy. And we sort of had this like unspoken, oh, it's on, you know, kind of attitude. So like the fourth day I wear a suit and Pete wears like a really nice suit. And I'm like, oh, wow, Pete's got good wardrobe. And Alex, one of the other main writers, you know, kind of like looks at us both and he's like, Eric, are you trying to compete with Pete for fashion, you know? And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, oh man, you don't know Pete very well. Like this is like Costa Rica declaring war on the United States. And I was like, okay. And so the next day I was like, I'm going to go for it. And I put on my tux. I own a tux that I've worn to the Ace Awards. And Pete shows up in this like incredible, bespoke, like amazing tuxedo with like crazy patterns on it. And I'm like, okay, I can't really compete with this guy. But Evan Goldberg looked at us sitting behind Video Village in our silly tuxedos and was like, okay, you morons, you know, now you're extras, get in there. And we hopped to and like jumped into place and the, you know, makeup like ran over to us and like touched us up for no reason. You can barely see us, but it was all so much fun. And so towards the end of the episode, when Seth and David Krumholtz are arguing, kind of like yelling at each other, if you look right between them, you can see Pete and I kind of chatting and acting like extras. I mean, it was so much fun.
It's your classic editor-writer game of cat and mouse that plays out into a whole fashion thing. I get it.
Classic. It's an old Hollywood tradition.
What a trope that is.
Yeah.
You know, running around town in L.A., doing on-location filming and editing. That's what LA does. Going to Vegas and shooting in a casino seems like a whole other level of crazy. What did you have to do differently to prep for that, if anything? It seemed like to me that would feel like not just another neighborhood in Los Angeles, but like going out somewhere and shooting a film.
Yeah. It was crazy. I mean, I think personally, like the hardest part of that for me was that it was very prescribed about like where we could be. You know, it was like Video Village had to be in this little corner of the casino and the shoot could be here, but you couldn't see this section. Like the casino had a lot of rules. And so what that meant for me was that like I was often farther from the actors than I was used to. So when I had like a note or a suggestion or a tightening or that kind of thing, I had to like run across the casino floor to like get to them, like give my note and then like run back. And so it was more running, basically, is what I'm trying to say. But we shot those 2 episodes last. And at that point, people were just dialed in. You know, the actors were so good and the camera crew were so good. So even though like it was sort of like felt more chaotic and like barely hanging together, it was still working because everyone knew the deal at that point.
There are so many great performances in this series. It's hard to have a favorite, but one of my favorites is Catherine Hahn's over-the-top marketing executive, and maybe that's redundant. Her performances must have been a lot of fun to watch firsthand and then work on later. That said, you're not even the only one in your family to cut a Catherine Hahn TV show. You want to explain that?
Yeah. My wife, Libby Cunin, is also an editor and a very talented one. It was actually pretty funny. She cut the show Agatha for Marvel, starring Catherine Hahn. Catherine went from that to shooting The Studio. So she sort of my wife handed Catherine Hahn to me. And then as soon as The Studio wrapped, Seth Rogen went on to shoot the 2nd season of Platonic, which my wife cut. So I handed Seth Rogen to her, which was a very weird, incestuous kind of thing. But it's really fun being married to an editor. We have a shorthand. We can talk exactly everything that am banging my head against the wall. She's also banged her head against the wall about it. And so we have great words of wisdom for each other. And it's a lot of fun. You did mention Catherine Hahn. I do have to tell you my favorite Catherine Hahn anecdote, which is that she goes into this like crazy fugue state sometimes where like she'll just like come up with an improv and like everyone will just die laughing and we'll be like, did you think about that? How did you come up? And she was like, it just popped into my head. I don't know. I just get into these modes. And so we were shooting this scene from the pilot and the line, it's the scene where they heard from Matt that Steve Buscemi is Martin Scorsese's preferred pick to star in this giant movie about the Jonestown massacre. And so the line to begin the scene is, okay, Steve Buscemi is worst case scenario. And jokes happen. But probably around like the 13th or 14th take, Catherine Hahn starts the scene and she says, okay, Steve Buscemi is worst case scenario. And literally like makes herself fall down on the ground laughing. Like she didn't know she was going to say that. And it just like sent her to the floor and everyone died. Everyone like laughed so hard. And we were like, okay, that's pretty funny. But, you know, like, come on, like, we can't be that silly. And so the next take, she does it again. She does the exact same thing. Steve Buscemi is worst case scenario. And everyone keeps it together. But if you look, the camera pans around and Ike, his mouth is hanging open because he cannot believe she did it again. And then he quickly closes his mouth. But like, you just catch for a split second his like complete and utter awe at Catherine Hahn for her insanity. And there's no other reason why his mouth would be hanging open. Like it's purely just appreciating the actress's insanity. So I urge you to go back and look at Ike's mouth hanging open.
I will gladly watch this series again for a third time. I enjoyed it that much. You know, there's a lot of great reasons to get into filmmaking and storytelling and being an editor. You know, there's the art itself. For me, it would be all about the swag. So I have to know, did you get any really cool Continental Studios swag when you were done?
I am wearing my Continental Studios hat right now, which unfortunately you can't see because I didn't bring a camera, but it's very nice. The beautiful thing about making up a fake studio is that you can make a lot of swag from the fake studio. So most of our swag doesn't even say the studio on it. It just says Continental Studios, which I really appreciate.
Well, I really appreciate the series. Who can't use a good laugh? And I appreciate you doing the interview.
Of course.
I hope it's obvious how much I really enjoyed this series. What is wrong with me that I actually want to see the Kool-Aid movie? Honestly, wouldn't you watch a movie about the Kool-Aid Man? You would if you knew it was Ice Cube playing the Kool-Aid Man. Here's hoping we get to see it in season 2 of The Studio. For now, we're just going to have to appreciate all the fun of Season 1 and the great job Eric did both on set and in the cutting room. So please join me in thanking Eric for his time on the show today. You don't have to say it out loud, just think it and he'll hear you. Now here's what I think, and I actually am going to say it out loud, and that is that Media Composer is the right choice for you if you're editing films or TV shows, or hope to do that someday. Why is it the right choice? Because it is the very best NLE when it comes to sharing projects as part of a team. And that is what true film and TV making is, teamwork. You know, teamwork makes the dream work and all that. Plus, it has an editing toolset that was developed and refined by editors all around the world for over 30 years. That's some serious editing knowledge baked into what is a very affordable toolset. Now, you don't have to listen to me. You don't even have to listen to all the editors we've had on this show. Although technically you have. No, what you should do is go see for yourself. So head on over to the Media Composer page on avid.com and check out all the latest about the greatest. Editing system, that is. Those of you in a hurry can feel free to click that link I put in the show notes. I gotta say, it feels good to get a rhythm going again on the podcast. I was having serious withdrawal symptoms. What can I say? I miss you when I'm not here. So let's do it again and do it again soon. Hopefully next week. Until then, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.